On August 24th, 2015, we are going to be covering conditionals. Conditionals are statements that are in if-then form. A lot of times we use the statement if P then Q, where P is your hypothesis of your statement and Q is the conclusion. Sorry, I can't spell. So, it's very easy to make an if-then statement from a statement that you're already given. For example, if I was given the statement, math teachers love their job, my P would be teaching math, the Q would be loving your job. So we're using the form if P then Q, so the answer would simply be if you teach math, then you love your job. Another example, if you're given the statement students hate homework, the P part would be being a student, the Q part would be hating homework. Again, we're trying to put it in if P then Q form to make a true conditional. It would be if you are a student, then you hate homework. One more example before we move on. If I give you the statement, Kevin's roommate plays guitar, your P would be being Kevin's roommate, your Q would be playing guitar. So, using the template of if P then Q, if you share rent with Kevin, then you play guitar. Now here, if you had said if you are Kevin's roommate, then you play guitar, that would have been also correct. The thing is here, everybody thinks differently and will write these statements differently. Just as long as you have your P and the Q in the right places, the statement should be correct. Alright, now, once you can write your conditional in if-then form, then you can find the certain ways of stating the statement in different ways. The first one is the converse. The converse just means to flip the arrangement around. I like to call this converse. Converse sounds a lot like the word convert, right? Well, convert to me means you're going to switch. So, converse simply means switch. Okay? So if you remember converse is like convert, which means switch, then if you started with if P then Q, your converse would be if Q then P. For example, if you teach math, then you love your job. It's easy to find your P in here and your Q because it's already in if-then form. Then all you do is switch them, and it becomes if you love your job, then you teach math. Another example is if you share rent with Kevin, then you play guitar. Again, P and Q, very simply stated here. Being Kevin's roommate is your P, Q is playing guitar. So your converse would be if you play guitar, then you share rent with Kevin. Now, let's talk about another thing you can find, that's called the inverse. When I think of the word inverse, I think of invert. And invert means to find the opposite or to negate it. Okay? Which I also put as putting in the word not into both sides. So, if you start with if P then Q, then you turn it into if not P, then not Q. So let's give it a try. If you're a student, then you hate homework. If I was to do the inverse, I'm going to put the same statement in the same order, just putting in not in both sides. So it would come down here and be, if you are not a student, then you love homework. Or you could have said, instead of love, you could have said, you don't hate homework. There's many different ways to express this. Here's another example of finding an inverse. If you teach math, then you love your job. Well, all we do is put in, what's that magic word? Not in both sides. So it would be, if you do not teach math, then you hate your job. Or then you do not like your job, okay? Or do not love your job. All right, the last one we need to cover is your contrapositive. The contrapositive is both the converse and the inverse at the same time. Basically the collision of the two. I think you should see what this is telling you. It says you start with if P then Q. To find your contrapositive, you first find the converse, if Q then P. Then we find the inverse of the converse, if not Q then not P. To me, this sounds really confusing. So here's how I remember contrapositive. It's the longest word, right? So if it's the longest word, it means you do the most to it. And by that, if you look, it means you're taking the converse and the inverse. So I like to say switch, which is the converse, and not, which is the inverse. That's how you can find your contrapositive really simply. Switch it and not it all at the same time, and you'll get your contrapositive. So if I started with the statement, if you're a student, then you hate homework. If I switch it and not it, it would come out to, if you love homework, then you are not a student. Make sense? I hope so. Let's do another one. If you teach math, then you love your job. Well, if I do the contrapositive, I switch them first, then I not them. So it would be, if you hate your job, then you do not teach math. So to sum it up, here is the quick way of writing out what each of these is. A conditional is a statement in if P then Q form, in if and then form. If you find the converse of that conditional, it's if Q then P. Please remember, whenever you're writing a converse and inverse or contrapositive, you always go back to the conditional to write it. You do not do the inverse of the converse. That is the wrong way to do it. The converse, remember, you switch, right? Converse is switch. So it's just if Q, then P. They tell you to find the inverse. Again, you go back up to the conditional, and it's if not P, then not Q. So inverse means just add in not to both sides. Your last one is your contrapositive. You go back to the conditional, you look at it, and it turns into, you do both. You switch and not. So it would be if not Q, then not P. Okay, this sums up the notes for today. I hope that you understood them. If you have any further questions, please feel free to come and see me for tutoring.